Hey creeps, it's Horror Free For All. Continuing my passion project I affectionately call Gems from the Crypt, a series where I'll look at full length feature films that, in my opinion, represent and resemble what to me feels like a full length feature adaptation of something I would expect in one of my favorite horror anthology franchises ever made, Tales from the Crypt. For this specific episode, we're actually looking at a Stephen King short story adaptation film from 1997. Various people were involved with this movie, but ironically, none of the people involved in the making of the movie actually ever worked on Tales from the Crypt to my knowledge. Matter of fact, they all worked on other horror anthology properties that I quite love in their own regard. Specifically, Creepshow, Tales from the Dark Side, Monsters, and the Cat's Eye horror anthology movie. Yes, the creators of Creepshow and all the sister properties made a movie that feels like Tales from the Crypt. We're going to be looking at 1997's The Nightflyer. Now, The Nightflyer was written by Mark Pavia and Jack O'Donnell, and was also directed by Mark Pavia. And supposedly, Stephen King himself and Richard Rubenstein, who you might recognize in production roles on shows like Tales from the Dark Side and Monsters from the 80s and early 90s, they were kind of responsible for discovering Mark Pavia through some of his early work and thought that he would be a great fit to potentially adapt one of Stephen King's short stories for film. And as the story goes, Mark Pavia pitched his idea to Stephen King about his take on the Nightflyer story, which was a short story from a collection known as Nightmares and Dreamscapes that King put out in the early 90s, I believe. And Stephen King loved it to the point where he was sold and wanted Mark Pavia to be the head honcho for this project. And I have to say up front, for this being a first time watch for me, this film has been recommended to me many times on letterbox lists, through conversations I've had with fellow people who are interested in this niche that I'm after mentioning this film to me. And I can't believe I put it off as long as I did. This film, in my opinion, is legit a Tales from the Crypt episode stretched out into a 90 or so minutes, give or take, movie. With that being said, let's talk about The Nightflyer. So, the Nightflyer film opens up with a prologue of sorts where we see a gentleman that works on an airstrip uh, seeing a black airplane land on this air landing strip with some red striping, and he's telling the plane that he can't park his plane there essentially. So he goes over to investigate the plane after he gets no response and discovers that there's some weird things surrounding the plane in question. There might be some blood on the door handle, the door might be ajar, and there might be some dirt beneath the door with some maggots and worms crawling in it. But when the man goes to investigate what's inside, he has the door beaten in on his head, and then he's brutally attacked on his face by some sort of unseen creature. And as the man looks on, he sees essentially black pants, dark black shoes, and a black cloak covering the shadow of the face of whatever's attacking him. And we can only assume what's going to happen to him next. So when we cut to the main players of the story, after the prologue sets in, we get introduced to our main character of the story, who's played by the very talented Miguel Ferrer. And you might recognize Miguel Ferrer from an episode of Tales from the Crypt in the later seasons, as I did. And Miguel Ferrer plays this character named Richard Dees, who is a entitled, full of himself, know-it-all asshole at this tabloid paper, essentially. And he is the head writer, he is the top dog, and he intends it to stay that way. But one fateful day, after a string of attacks have happened in various parts of the east coast of the United States, this new up-and-coming reporter named Catherine Blair wants to get in on writing the next big story for this tabloid paper. And when she pitches this idea to her editor, who's in charge of the tabloid, the editor thinks that maybe, just maybe, it's not the right fit for her, but perhaps is going to be a better fit for Richard. And Richard initially scoffs at the idea of the story because once he hears it, he thinks that it's just going to be one of these silly vampire hoax stories that you see in countless tabloids everywhere else. And as the movie will allude to, yes, this story is about a unknown killer who flies around in an airplane and drains victims of their blood, leaves a bloody mess of the crime scene, and then disappears in said plane. So Richard decides to go venture out into a bar later that evening after he has a blow up with a fellow coworker of his who decided to change the front page of, I guess, that day's tabloid to not feature the story he's currently working on and believing in, to partake in some drinking. Well, he gets interrupted by this new girl, Catherine Blair, and she essentially tells him and strong arms him to stay away, which only prompts Richard to, bite back with her a little bit. And eventually, because of this altercation, he ends up changing his mind and wanting to do the story. This, of course, pisses off Catherine, but she can't do anything about it because Richard already has a lot of resources at his disposal that she just doesn't have that would make him more acceptable for this story. One, Richard has his own pilot's license and his own plane that he can use at his leisure. And two, he has the experience and the name recognition that she just doesn't have. So for a good while of the movie, until I guess later on, Catherine is left staying at the editing place where they work, trying to stew over what just happened. Meanwhile, Richard decides to take it upon himself to use his pilot's license and his plane to fly to these various towns that this supposed vampire killer has been to visit the crime scenes, to look at some bodies and gather up some evidence, and to also, I guess, add to this myriad of morbid images he takes with his own personal camera, so he can use them to help sell his sensationalist stories. Well, as the movie would proclaim, Richard early on is visiting, I guess, the body of the first victim that we saw in the prologue, and notices some weird things on the body. As well, around this time of the movie, he has taken upon himself to go to a graveyard, I guess, to sabotage a grave and to smear some blood on it to gather some pictures. But when he does this, he realizes that he's starting to put these events together through some, I guess, supernatural visions that he's been receiving, that maybe there is something here actually supernatural going on. And this should be said about Richard's character before we go any further. Richard is somebody who clearly believes in tabloid journalism, and he has this motto that I think the film quite highlights with his character. He goes by this philosophy that you should never publish what you believe in, and you should never believe in what you publish. And you're going to see a lot of that theming in this story. Well, Richard finds himself in too deep after visiting the first victim, and he heads to another town and this place in Maryland to follow up on a couple who, I guess, lived off an airstrip that were also rumored to be victims of this killer. And from there, the story kind of spirals for Richard's character as he's starting to become taunted by this supposed killer. And around this point, Richard decides to don the killer's name as the Nightflyer because he's a supposed vampire that's traveling in an airplane, and it seems to fit. Well, when he's investigating the couple and he's taking some testimony from witnesses who maybe noticed the behavior of the victims that day they died, essentially, we see him still acting like an asshole to these eyewitnesses. Once there's an accident that happens in the middle of the road, he decides to make a pit stop and take some more photos, and it becomes evident to him, it's kind of like a ding in the light bulb of the head, that he needs to be one step ahead of the killer because he's stuck trailing this guy, and the only way to be ahead of the curve is perhaps with an advantage. But he doesn't have all the information and maybe the know-it-all that he thinks he does. Which brings Catherine Blair back into the story. As I said earlier, she was kind of shelved for a good portion of the movie because Richard got the job. But because the editor noticed that Catherine was kind of upset at the situation, he decides to make it competitive with the two and allows her to go on her own personal investigation to possibly gather up her own evidence, and maybe she can be the person to bring the story to him so she can get the credit. And once Richard catches wind of this after a fate encounter at a hotel, he decides that maybe two heads are better than one and they should work together. Richard is finally able to use Catherine to his advantage, and essentially they ended up finding this airport in Wilmington, North Carolina, where the Nightflyer could potentially be currently at, and that's probably going to be the next place where he's going to strike. So, armed with this information, Richard makes a decision with Catherine and essentially decides to go solo on this, let's just say, and decides to head down to Wilmington by himself to catch the Nightflyer in the act and gather ultimate proof that there's a crazed killer using an airplane as a vehicle for murder. But once he arrives to the airport in Wilmington, he sees firsthand, live and in color, what this carnage actually entails. And this kind of proves to him what he's been trying to cope with and mask the entire movie, and that is that there really is a vampire doing all of these killings. And when it comes down to it, we hit the inevitable fate encounter with Richard Dees and the Nightflyer killer. But there's a plot twist. There is something to be put up there with a dual interpretation about what this movie was actually saying with Richard's character. And perhaps it has to do with a literal interaction that he has with the said vampire killer after he witnesses what has happened inside of this airport terminal. And let's just say the vampire got one up on Richard and might be trying to frame him for everything that's been going on. And that's where I'll leave it. We get an ending of the story that's quite tragic for a particular character involved, but we also get caught up to speed with another character who comes on the scene and realizes the gravity of the situation, and also the shortcomings and pitfalls of, let's just say, a fallen character, and decides to make their own move to appease everyone in the situation and get themselves out of potential harm, like a certain character had faced in the story. And without being too explicit with details and completely spoiling the end of the movie, that's what you're going to expect out of the Nightflyer. Now, I want to talk about this movie a little more in depth here in the review portion now, because I think that this movie has a lot of great things going for it. First and foremost, this is a Stephen King adaptation, so there's going to be some Stephen King hallmarks that you're going to recognize in this film. Particularly for me, the use of Wilmington, North Carolina being a set piece of the story screams Stephen King adaptations to me. I mean, Maximum Overdrive was filmed there. The Cat's Eye was filmed and set there, if I'm not mistaken, as well. And there is various links in lineage going back to people like Dino De Laurentiis and Richard Rubenstein and Stephen King, kind of building the foundation of what became known as Wilmywood. And for this movie supposedly being filmed in Wilmington, North Carolina, where I lived for, in my personal life for a few years, this tickles my heartstrings, I guess more than others, as it would pertain to the location, I guess. But I really enjoyed that aspect to this movie, and I like the secret nods and mentions of various towns that we've seen in other Stephen King books. And I'm going to say this up front. I love me a good reluctant hero / anti-hero movie. And what I'm getting at is something akin to Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, where you have a main character who isn't likable and is thrown into a situation where they, by their own volition or they by happenstance, have to kind of be the hero and solve something that could potentially save people's lives, directly and indirectly. As the case here for Richard Dees, he legit feels like a textbook character that you would expect out of Tales from the Crypt in all of the best ways possible. He's not likable. He's full of himself. He's a pompous asshole, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to come out on top and keep his position in his line of work. And it doesn't matter to him who he has to trample, who he has to walk all over. And when it comes to him interacting with this vampire killer in the movie, he acts unfazed because he legit doesn't think or doesn't want it to admit to himself that he's in actual danger. So obviously this story is going to be built up to provide this character, Richard Dees, comeuppance. And it's so glorious because the movie goes out of its way to show you that this character is hateable, but you kind of have to like him because compared to what he's up against, that's potentially worse than who this guy is. And I'm going to be upfront. This movie does this classic setup where they're trying to cloak the vampire's face and appearance throughout the entire movie. And as the movie goes along, we get snippets of silhouettes of this creature and what it can possibly look like. And we see where he lives inside of his plane. We see this scene. I didn't go over it in the plot, but I'll touch on it here briefly. When Richard arrives in Wilmington, he looks inside of the plane and sees blood on the door like the guy from the prologue saw, and he sees that there's blood all over the dashboard. There's some dirt with maggots and worms in the back of the plane. And there's also a little book that's very old looking, possibly from the 20s or 30s, that Dees finds and looks through, and it seems to be that this was possibly the human form of whoever this killer was before he became a vampire killer. So I think that the movie provides you enough guessing game to work with, but once you get to the eventual meeting of Richard and this creature, the creature design looks one of a kind for a vampire movie. It's absolutely incredible. And even how the vampire kills people in the movie is very inventive and almost ingenious. And I have to tip my hat to Mark Pavia here because I think he added this notion to the story more than Stephen King's source material did, from what I gather. And that's this notion that the vampire has one singular fang on his top jaw that impales people's necks. And while he sucks the blood completely out of people, the vampire is smart and knows that if he does too much, typical, stereotypical vampire killing stuff that only can be transcribed to be vampire phenomenon, the mainstream might catch on and might start to believe that vampires exist. So we see these little idiosyncrasies that he does, like cutting the heads off of victims, making a bloodbath, blood splatter spree all over crime scenes to make it look like it could have been just a guy hacking people up with an axe or something. So I think that's a really cool twist that they added to a vampire, whodunit movie that I didn't really think of beforehand that could have been something you can change in a hypothetical film. But since it's here, I'm very glad it was done here, and I think it was done very well. And one last thing that I think this movie does very well in terms of other things other than like the themes that tie into the story, which I'll get into after this, I really like the exploration of this character, Catherine Blair, and her inclusion in the story. I like that she's an antagonistic and helpful force at times for our main character, and I like that she ends up in the story where she does. I think that's a very good way to end it off, and to my knowledge, I think the original intention for this film, if it was a mainstream success, was to make a follow-up and expand more onto the mythos of the Nightflyer and expand more onto Catherine Blair's character. And I would have loved that. Unfortunately, the film did not perform well and never got the sequel. So in hindsight, there is some issues to be had with this film because it's its own standalone thing. But, I do think that because there's so much left on the table here, it leaves room for fans wanting more. And I really do like that about this movie. After I finished watching it, it made me feel like I wanted to explore these characters more and maybe do a follow up movie. The fact that it made me want a sequel gets a thumb up. Now, moving on into maybe why this movie feels like Tales from the Crypt so much, I would say that on the surface, it's easy to see the superficial things. You know, you have a dickhead main character or an unconventional main character that's unlikable, and an obvious angle of comeuppance going to be had with said character. But there's some good themes here that tie in the underbelly of the story that makes a great Tales from the Crypt story a great one. Now, I already mentioned Richard goes by this philosophy of don't publish what you believe in and don't believe in what you publish, or something like that. And that ties very well into the story, as this entire movie is a metaphor on sensationalist journalism and tabloid culture. Yes, tabloid culture is known for, I guess, trying to monetize tragedy and, be an invasion of privacy for celebrities inherently. And in this movie, while we don't see necessarily the invasion of privacy for celebrities side of tabloid culture, we do see the sensationalist side of violence and, I guess, supernatural happenings that run into the conspiratorial field that run amok in the tabloids. And we see the main character, Richard, um, having this coping mechanism as he's experiencing these supernatural phenomenon. He refuses to believe in it because he doesn't want to believe in it. And as the movie goes along, he's kind of forced to put that stubbornness aside and admit to himself that the coping needs to stop and this stuff is possibly real. And when he finally comes to that realization, it's pretty much all in the bag and it's too late. And I think that this story sends home that message beautifully, that there is a problem with tabloid culture and inherently, and that is kind of stretching the truth, trying to make a story out of thin air. And perhaps this ties symmetrically to the fate of Richard Dees in the story. He also mentioned another quote in the movie that I think is also very poetic with what I'm about to say. He mentions to Catherine at one point of the film that stories are like a cancer that gets inside of you and then it kills you from like the inside out, essentially. That's literally what happens to Richard in the story. He becomes so consumed about making this story the best story he possibly can and trying to fabricate what he can from the evidence he gathers with the photos, with testimonials, trying to hunt this guy down, that he loses sight of perhaps maybe what's more important than making the story. And that's his own safety. And he fails to remember something happened similarly, I guess, off screen to one of his coworkers that worked with him prior to Catherine getting hired in her position. And Catherine even brings this up to him, but he fails to listen to that. So I think that this story really does beautifully connect these ideas together, and using a vampire who travels in an airplane to go from random airport to random airport on the East Coast of the United States to kill people, drain their blood, mutilate their bodies. That sounds like a tabloid story waiting to write itself, right? And, the execution of the story makes it really hit home that this could have been maybe a two-part episode in the Tales from the Crypt show. I think it would have been ingenious to include a Stephen King story, and by far, if there was any story I've seen from Stephen King adapted to screen that should have been put into that show or associated with it, it's this one. And now I know a lot of it has to deal with Mark Pavilla's input, but it's a match made in heaven there. Now, when it comes to negatives, I'm just going to be upfront and brief with these because they're not the biggest ones ever, but they are here. Now, my negatives with the movie pretty much stem down to how the movie decides to propagate events in the story. It's very linear in its focus at first, or I guess I should say the first 2/3 of the film, as it's deliberately just showing you bits and pieces of eyewitness testimony and these finding these bodies in these various towns, or I guess things associated with the victims, just to show the audience these little things that the vampire did at the crime scene, in terms of like mutilating bodies and enacting violence on people, just to build up the suspense and terror of what's going to happen to Dees if he gets caught by the vampire killer, which is good on paper, but the story never really explores the modus operandi of the said vampire killer. It just presents these things in a vague way where the viewer has to kind of fill in the blanks in their mind about it all, which I guess can be cool for particular people out there. But I think for this particular story, there needs to be more about the vampire. Perhaps maybe dabble into his origins. Who was this person before they became this vampire? Why do they have these specific abilities? Why do they play with the victims like toys before they kill them? Why does he have certain practices with certain victims over the others? This movie just never really explores that side of it. It just presents these things as consequences of this vampire's actions, but never shows the viewer why these consequences are important. Which I guess would cloud the real message of the movie, all said and done. So I kind of get it on a constructive level. But like I said, I think that this is a hindsight problem because I can clearly tell after watching the film in its entirety that they were completely willing to lean into another film to explore all these questions that the viewer had in the first movie, which does hurt this film as a standalone movie, all said and done. And to kind of coincide with that, one last minor thing is that there's some random weird choices from Richard Dees as a main character who seemingly has prior knowledge about vampire stories already, that he knows from off-screen events that we weren't informed of in the film beforehand. So when he comes to these realizations in the movie, for example, when he goes to the graveyard to sabotage it, he thinks it would be a good idea to tilt the tombstone and cut his finger and slather it onto the grave marker to make it look like this was a vampire's place or dwelling. But he also knows at the same time that this possibly is a thing that vampires do. How does he know this? Like, where's he coming up with these ideas from? The movie doesn't explore Richard's past into, tabloid macabre writing and stories that he's fabricated in the past. No, he just spends all of this focus using this prior knowledge that we don't know that he knew prior to the events of the film. And it just comes across as confusing sometimes and kind of plot conveniency for my liking. Now, where I landed with this film on a 0 to 5 star basis, I thought that this film was exceptional. As a matter of fact, I was pretty sure that I was going to give this thing no less than a 4.5 right before I got to the ending of it. But by the ending of it, it helped me see those hindsight issues a little more. And the fact that we never got a sequel to kind of clear up some of these answers that we have made me think that, it's maybe not that high. But I did give it the highest score I possibly could give it despite that. And I gave it a 4.25 out of 5 stars. To me, this is a must-watch for Tales from the Crypt fans, for Stephen King fans, and for anthology horror fans out there. It works very well as a short story adaptation. And in my opinion, from what I've read so far of the short story, I'm not done with it yet, I definitely prefer this film over the short story counterpart. And who knows, this movie could be a proof of concept that maybe, just maybe, one day we can get a Popsy adaptation. That would be fucking awesome. So that's all I have to say about Stephen King's The Nightflyer. And let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this movie before, what's your thoughts on it? And if you have any films that feel like Tales from the Crypt in your opinion that I haven't covered yet on this series, let me know down in the comment section as well. I'm always looking for some cool movies to check out and make more content for you all. Until next time, take care.